Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, welcome to Carers World Investigates. I'm Tom Magner, and in this edition we focus on the continuing controversy over universal credit, the new flagship benefit that's leading the way on the UK government's reform of the benefit system. As so often with politics, there's a lot of talk, but for those struggling to apply for and be granted the benefit that's become known as UC, daily life is a mistake away from a world of rent arrears and food banks. As benefits advisor Maria Zealey tells me, UC is in theory a simple idea.
Well, universal credit is the new benefit for working age people that the government is introducing across the country that rolls up 6 of the current means-tested benefits into a single payment. It will be administered by the Department for Work and Pensions, and it's going to replace, eventually, housing benefit, income support, both child and working tax credits, income-based job seekers allowance, and income-based employment and support allowance.
So it's supposed, in a sense, to be a super streamlined benefit. Is that the purpose, as you understand it?
Yes, one of the key aims of universal credit is to simplify the benefit system. So when people make a claim, it will be a single claim. It will be from a single agency. So currently people, if they are in receipt of more than one benefit, might have to go to their local council and to HMRC and to the Department for Work and Pensions. So this will simplify the claims process.
Now, we can hardly escape the controversy surrounding universal credit, and obviously I want to go into that in a little more detail. But before we do, and to take some of the our viewers' questions, can you explain in simple terms the process for claiming universal credit, the key steps? Because I have to say, in our investigation, it's been hard to establish exactly how you go about claiming.
Well, the government's ambition is for most of the people to apply online. So it is an end-to-end digital process. Before making a claim, people need to set up a universal credit account online. And this involves passwords, and also it involves your identity to be verified. Now, parts of this system are not yet fully up and running. So it still also may involve a number of phone calls. And once you have made your claim for universal credit through your universal credit account, messages may be placed on your journal, but also you will probably have to have at least one appointment with your local Job Centre Plus office. So from start to finish, it could be a number of weeks before your claim is even completed.
Okay, so that's how, in theory, it should work. I've been to Inverness, which is one of the areas that's piloted this and is now being rolled out across Inverness. I've been up there to find out how people are viewing that. Here's what they had to say.
Don't think it's somebody poor over there or somebody feckless over there. Not at all. That there's a very thin curtain between all of us and the impact of universal credit. And if you're divorced, especially if you're a woman, you're poorer. If you become ill, you're poorer. If you lose your home, you're poorer. If you've got a disability, you're poorer. All of these things can happen to anyone or to someone else in your family. And therefore, I just feel that no one should actually underestimate how close you could be to having to deal with this system. And at the moment, this system is seriously letting down too many people because of the way it's being administered.
I don't worry about the people that come through our door. I don't worry about the people that have sought advice from our local MPs or from support groups such as HUG. Who I worry about are the people that do not access services because they're not being well informed, they're missing out on benefits. If you're well informed, you can make the right choices for you. If you come into us, we can do social policy work because of your experiences. People need to knock the door, pick up the phone, walk through an office door and speak to us.
We're seeing a lot of people that are extremely frustrated about the maladministration that UC has brought about. We are really seriously disadvantaged by the fact that we can't have a dialogue directly with the local government departments, because the consent aspect is significant for us. In years gone by, we were able to have, with the client consent, a one piece of consent, rather than this continual requirement that every time you make a conversation, call or email, you have to have an up-to-date dated consent form. And it becomes extremely frustrating to try and resolve things on the client's behalf without their involvement on a very regular basis. And a lot of our people are either working or they are very, very sick, and they can't be at our beck and call. And also, we don't really know as to which day we're actually going to be able to deal with their issue. So, and you can sometimes deal with more than one issue at a time. So the consent thing is a big thing for us. The actual process of how UC is administered is very, very difficult for the clients to understand. And in particular, when they're asked to have very detailed IT knowledge, they're having to have access to IT equipment, they have to have a good understanding of how you input typing skills. I mean, not a lot of people can actually type fast. And also, when we heard today at the meeting that, they're putting journal entries on there and they're being completely ignored.
Actually, one of the most important things is that they shouldn't have to come and see their MP. They should be able to get the right treatment, be able to navigate the system with dignity, without humiliation, and actually get what they're entitled to. Because this isn't just about people who are seeking work, it's about people who are disabled, who are in work, single parents. It's a whole range of our society. And not to fix this, not to address this seriously, undermines our communities.
You're asking me to put my feet in the shoes of a Tory government. I mean, I don't know. I think they're wedded to their ideology, and their ideology is about making work pay. But I think there's something in it about punishing poor people as well. You really would have to ask them why they're not listening, but it's not for lack of evidence being put forward, and being put forward very powerfully, both emotional evidence, like we've heard today, but cold, hard economic facts. I mean, this is a cost-saving exercise, and it's definitely costing money, because tipping people into complete crisis is quite expensive for the state. There's extra money being spent on sheriffs, on cases going to court. There's extra money being spent by councils, mitigating hardship and coping with arrears. So this is an expensive cost-saving exercise. I don't know why they're not listening, and I can only assume it's because they don't want to.
Margaret Davison, the leader of the Highland Council, said in that film that it was very fragile, that people were walking a tightrope between everything being all right or them being plunged into destitution. Is that something you've seen in your work?
Well, a lot of people will be adversely affected by universal credit being a single payment. And that's because of the reasons how they arrive at needing to claim universal credit. So if they have a sudden shock in their circumstances, such as losing their job or illness, or their relationship breaks down, then if they're unprepared, they're not going to have any financial cushion to tide them over whilst they are waiting for this new benefit, the claim to be completed, and also, as we hear, have heard on the media, this extensive waiting period before the first payment hits your bank account. So I think destitution is a strong word, but I don't think that it is a hyperbole.
Another of the comments from Leslie Newton at the Inverness Citizens Advice Bureau was she's saying that she's found serious communication problems with the DWP, and also that in the traditional CAB way, or contrary to the traditional CAB way, she can't act on people's behalf because there's no form of implied consent. So a lot of people have had to go to the office of Drew Hendry's office, the Scottish Nationalist MP for Inverness, who has got implied consent because he's an MP. How much is this a problem?
Well, there's two parts to that question. I think the first difficulty with a sort of a fluid flow to resolve people's problems is that the default is to deal with things digitally. So people are encouraged to ask questions, to place messages on their online journal, and then there is no way of knowing when that might be responded to. So it's a staggered, stuttered way of communicating with universal credit. The second issue is that if you do need help from an advocate, an intermediary, such as a CAB advisor, then yes, there is this severe issue that the old rules around implied consent, where we have permission from the client to speak to a government agency, are no longer taken as read. And Universal Credit has started out saying that they need explicit consent about specific issues relating to someone's universal credit, which at the moment only MPs appear to hold.
Elaine Donnelly in that film, one of the colleagues of Leslie Newton, made a very, really quite a almost frightening thought. She said that it isn't possible to fast track people who are terminally ill, for example. There's no system for, well, fast tracking basically. It's not like airport security where you've got a special channel you can get through if you've got special circumstances. To what extent have you found that to be true?
Well, there is I think a groundswell of concerns around this issue. Organisations that are supporting people with severe illnesses and life-limiting illnesses are already feeding back to government about their concerns as to how or why this waiting period cannot be more flexible for people in very serious situations concerning their illness. I think that government is able to consider some of these things with other benefits. We have fast tracking with employment and support allowance, with personal independence payment, and with attendance allowance. So I think we would like to see a consistent policy with terminally ill people being treated with more sort of care and understanding.
I'd just like to put some points that various politicians have made. Obviously, I'm not asking you to make a political comment, just to establish how much of this is your experience at Surrey Welfare Rights Unit. The Right Honourable Norman Lamb MP for the Liberal Democrats says essentially the system was doomed to failure from the start. Great system in theory, but the then Chancellor George Osborne essentially took a lot of money out of it, so there wasn't much of a pool of money to be able to work universal credit. To what extent are you seeing this as a problem of restrictions of money? Is that why this process seems to be so tough?
Well, as you're probably aware, Universal Credit did have cross-party support when it made its passage through Parliament way back in 2012, I think. And it wasn't until we actually saw the detail of the legislation that we could then make these comparisons with our current legacy benefits against how households would fare under universal credit. And even since 2013, when universal credit started to be slowly introduced, we have seen legislation bringing in further changes that actually have made it tougher for an awful lot of people. So when we're comparing like with like, changes such as cutting the worker allowances significantly really does bring into question the government's primary aim, which was to make work pay, and universal credit would support that. It does bring that into serious question. But also we have concerns that some very vulnerable households will be worse off under universal credit when you are comparing like for like, such as some families with a disabled child, such as some severely disabled people who live alone, and also full-time carers who themselves might have a long-term enduring illness or disability. So there are some real concerns that some people, once this is fully rolled out, will financially struggle much more under this system.
So it seems there might be some sort of mileage in what he said. One of the other points made by one of the contributors to the Inverness conference, Marie Todd, who's then a backbencher in the Scottish Parliament, now actually a minister, but we are still allowed to continue with what she's had to say. She was sort of saying, making a point that rather than you mentioned that phrase, making work pay, or equivalent to that, she views it as using benefits as a punishment. Now, do you see anything in your day-to-day experiences that would suggest this is true, or otherwise?
Well, it'll be different for different households. It's very difficult to sort of talk about benefits in general terms when households are so very different in their circumstances, and therefore benefits need to work with those differences and those subtleties of household makeup and income and hours worked and different situations. So I don't, I can't make sort of a blanket sort of response to that. But I think that the aims of universal credit, which should be a simplification, a streamlined claims process, government should work towards achieving that. If the feedback is that that's not working at the moment, then government should be working towards improving those operational systems.
Let's just, our investigation, which has been lengthy and has proved somewhat complicated at times, but we think on Carers World Radio Plus, we've identified 6 problems. I just wonder if we could go through them now and just see to what extent you think they're true and your reaction to them. The first one seems to be fundamental, and you referred earlier on to a change in circumstances potentially leading to problems. A number of people have reported that they're what's been called a legacy benefit, the benefits that went before they were rolled into universal credit, that if you ring up and say you've got a change of circumstances and you're on one of those legacy benefits, your payment is cut off immediately, even before you've started the process of applying for universal credit. Is that something you're aware of?
There is a number of changes of circumstance, particularly where universal credit has rolled out fully, that will bring your, as you rightly said, your legacy benefits to an end. So then you're in universal credit land. Initially, for an awful lot of claimants, there may then be a 7-day wait of non-entitlement. There is almost certainly then a 5-week wait before your first payment. Now, where universal credit has arrived, there may well be no choice but to claim universal credit. And once you're on universal credit, it is what's often referred to as a lobster pot system. Once you're in, you can't get out. So yes, I agree with your statement there that for some people, just a small change in their circumstance could bring their current entitlement to a sudden end, and they will be on the universal credit treadmill.
You mentioned earlier on the journal. Before I put the next point to you, perhaps you could just explain what this journal is. It sounds very mysterious.
Well, the journal is part of your universal credit account. So as the first step towards making a claim for universal credit, people are encouraged or have to go to the gov.uk website and search for universal credit. Then depending on the postcode that they put in, they will then be steered towards the correct claims process. So eventually everyone will be making these full digital claims online through that website. And the journal is almost like your message book. So it's a two-way, it's like having a sort of a notepad on the kitchen table. So universal credit will leave messages or directions or statements for you, then also tell you about when and how much your next universal credit payment is likely to be. But also you can put messages on there and ask questions and view things through that journal. So it's a common place where you and universal credit communicate.
So it's effectively is it right to say it's the only means by which a person claiming can communicate with the DWP and vice versa? In your analogy about the notebook, it's almost like you're on one side of the kitchen table, the DWP are on the other side. You've both got pens, but you write in the same notebook.
well, maybe if they're across on the kitchen table, I'd probably talk to them. It's the default.
Well, it's an online table,
Yeah.
a virtual
It's a
kitchen.
to talk to Universal Credit, but there is a telephone helpline, and obviously that has been in the headlines recently as well. So our understanding is, and I'm afraid I don't yet know the date exactly, but our understanding is that that Universal Credit telephone helpline will go down to an affordable rate or a free phone, depending on whether you're using mobiles or not, from some date in December. That's what government said when it came out in the media, that the calls currently were at sometimes a very, very high rate per minute.
Sorry, yeah, we're talking about this virtual kitchen and this notepad on the virtual table called the journal. A big problem seems to be the state of computer literacy, assumptions that people have fast internet, all sorts of things that are outside people's control. And yet people get sanctioned because they don't do something that's in their journal, but maybe they couldn't connect to their journal. And if they fail to comply, and my understanding is that you have to start your application all over again. But perhaps you can just shed a little light on that.
Well, again, it's twofold. You can't be sanctioned unless you're already on Universal Credit. So the first thing is to make sure that you've got digital access in order to make the claim and to pick up any messages and to attend any appointments that have been posted in your journal. Once your claim is in place, Universal Credit then, to a certain extent, requires you to have ongoing digital access. And in a way, that's going to be more onerous for some people because it will mean regularly checking their journal or regularly confirming that their claimant commitment, they have seen it and they accept any changes if there are any. There will also have to be regular access to the online system for people who are self-employed as well. So on one hand, it is the claim, yes, but actually for an awful lot of claimants, there will have to be ongoing access to the internet.
Okay, and one of the things, perhaps this is more a problem at the beginning and goes back to this point about Citizens Advice Bureau not being the traditional scenario of implied consent to help somebody. We understand at Care as Well Radio Plus that there are a number of problems if English isn't your first language. So you actually need an interpreter. And it seems on these cases that the DWP is not accepting the interpreter. And in a few cases, actually suggesting they're prompting the person claiming. Have you come across this problem of language?
We haven't come across that problem here at the unit, but in general terms across all welfare benefits, because they are so complex, this language, but also literacy, and of course the digital skills thing as well, are all additional barriers to making sure that people can access services, make claims, and also following a claim, check that their award is the correct award. And if they need to come back with more information or notify of a change of circumstance, then language and literacy problems are also, going to frustrate that problem for an awful lot of people. I think the implied versus explicit consent is something that isn't going to go away anytime soon. And I think that there needs to be more conversations with the DWP, because everybody is working together. This isn't sort of one side against the other side. Everybody is trying to make sure that the right benefit is claimed at the right time, and everybody avoids overpayments or underpayments.
Another thing that we've discovered is that it appears that people don't understand something called the claimant commitment until a problem actually arises. What exactly is this? The government tell us that it's an absolutely core aspect of universal credit.
Yes. Job seekers will be well used to job seekers agreements because they've been around for a number of years. Claimant commitment sort of takes that idea one step further. So every adult in a universal credit claim, so you'll either be a single person claiming universal credit, or if you are a couple, you have to make a couple's claim. And each one of those two adults will have their own claimant commitment agreement. You'll be able to, in the full version of Universal Credit, you'll be able to go into your journal and look at the details of that. And the claimant commitment basically is your agreement with Universal Credit as to what work you may be required to undertake. So people who are already in work and earning enough, there are earnings thresholds set, then their claimant commitment will have a tick against it. They will be meeting it. But for people who are looking for work, or maybe are what may be sometimes referred to as underemployed, so they might only be in part-time work, the claimant commitment might be asking them to do more. Now, if they can demonstrate that they are trying to change that situation, then their Universal Credit should be safe. But for some people who cannot meet their claimant commitment and the DWP doesn't accept the reasons why they can't meet it, then they could risk a sanction on their payment.
In terms of the claimant commitment, could there be a problem, say, for someone who's caring for another person, but they're not known to be caring for another person for whatever reason? So they're sort of under the radar. Is there a, because the claimant commitment sounds a bit like obey the rules or go away.
Yes, yes. For carers in particular, full-time carers who, if I could use the word recognised, so they are either in receipt of carers allowance or they're entitled to carers allowance, their claimant commitment will state that they are not expected to be in any paid work. So they are in what's called the no work related group. But of course, for many people, they actually have two carers, or two carers might be sharing responsibilities looking after one person. And because of their other circumstances, they're not actually receiving or entitled to carers allowance. What we would say is that you still need to tell Universal Credit about any caring responsibilities that you have. So that's whether you are caring for a disabled person or whether you have responsibilities for a dependent child. Tell Universal Credit, because that should then be reflected in your claimant commitment. Now, one of the issues that we have been seeing fed back across welfare rights organisations is that claimant commitments are often rather generic and don't seem to be reflecting the personal circumstances of individuals. So we would say, make sure that they know about your caring responsibilities and make sure you see that reflected in the level of work that you're expected to seek.
Sort of, if in doubt, tell them, tell the DWP.
Absolutely.
One of the points you made earlier on was about waiting time, and that's obviously something people are saying are too long, especially in a situation where the legacy benefit payment has been removed at the very beginning. Would you, presumably you would like to see waiting time disappear altogether?
Well, whether it's waiting times or whether it's benefit run-on, benefit run-on is a system that has been used before amongst welfare benefits, where when your circumstances change, for example, when you move into work, so you don't have that sudden jolt before your first pay packet, the benefits that you were on could continue for a number of weeks. So there are a variety of different mechanisms that government could consider so that people don't sort of fall off the edge of this cliff for 5 weeks. Now, after 2 weeks within that 5-week waiting period, and as I said earlier, that could actually be extended to 6 weeks in some circumstances. Government has said that after the first 2 weeks, if you are financially short, then you could apply for a benefit advance of Universal Credit. But these have to be paid back. They have to be paid back within the first 6 months. They will only pay a proportion of what you will eventually expect under Universal Credit, and you can only receive one advance. So I don't think that that's necessarily the fix that we would be looking for.
And in terms of one of the benefits that's been put into Universal Credit, in employment and support allowance, we've been told at Carers World Radio Plus that some people are being forced onto Universal Credit after what's been described as an inadequate or incompetent assessment poor decision making essentially on the part of the DWP, possibly arising out of a lack of willingness to listen. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there is plenty of evidence that the working capability assessments, the medicals that are carried out on behalf of government to assess people's entitlement to employment and support allowance, are still falling short of the quality and standards that they should be. Now, in areas where universal credit has fully rolled out, if your ESA is stopped because you've failed to get sufficient points at a medical, and you need to claim an alternative benefit whilst you're waiting for a mandatory reconsideration, which is asking ESA to look again at their decision, if you need money and you're in a full universal credit area, then you will have no choice but to claim universal credit or not claim the benefit and wait until the mandatory reconsideration. Now, the problem is in these full areas is that if, and for example, an appeal tribunal then overturns the decision and says that the DWP was incorrect and that you were entitled to your ESA, universal credit you are now in the lobster pot. Universal credit has now caught you and you cannot return back onto ESA as you were. So the appeal will pay you up to the date of when you claimed universal credit, but it won't go beyond that date. And for some people, depending on their circumstances, they will be worse off.
We've covered quite a lot of ground on universal credit and some of the issues that we've uncovered on Carers World Radio, plus other issues our viewers will have heard about through the press. Let's come to some of the questions that we've been asked to put to you by different viewers. First of all, the case of John. He is 51 years old. He'd not received any payments in months and was surviving on food bank vouchers. Because of the 6-week wait for his first payment, he says he was pushed into rent arrears, which amounted to around £900, and experienced a series of incorrect payments or no payments at all from the DWP. What do you think he could do in those circumstances, if anything?
Well, obviously seek help from a citizen's advice or another local advice agency. I think it's worrying that once universal credit, that the waiting period is a fait accompli at the moment, unless government has the appetite to change that. But once you've spent that waiting time, to then have incorrect payments is a worry, because universal credit hasn't yet rolled out. There are still a tiny proportion of the eventual numbers that will be on universal credit. So these significant wrinkles need to be dealt with at this early stage. People shouldn't be getting incorrect payments. All the information is there. With that scenario, the other concern, of course, is how patient and tolerant John's landlord is. Those rent arrears are the arrears to his landlord, presumably. And what we don't want to see is landlords leaving the market or excluding people on universal credit because of the DWP's errors or delays in making payments. That would be a very, very worrying trend.
You mentioned landlords. I'm not sure whether it's the case with John or not, but certainly when I was in Inverness, I discovered a number of people who had universal credit problems. It frequently led to rent arrears, and those rent arrears, their landlord was in fact the local council. And when I spoke to Margaret Davison, the leader of the Highland Council, she was saying local authorities are in a different position, because I as you will have seen, I put to her that, well, if the council understands, why don't you defer those payments and not plunge them into rent arrears? But of course, she's making the point that councils are strapped for cash. Is there anything you believe, if your landlord is the local authority, anything special you might be able to do compared to a private landlord, perhaps?
Well, I would hope if rent arrears are building up due to a delay in universal credit, then I would hope that any social landlord wouldn't start taking any action. It's probably unlikely that they would not be at least keeping a record of those arrears. But I think what we would expect is a certain level of tolerance if it's down to a universal credit delay. Now, obviously, after the 5 or 6 week delay, when universal credit is then paid, that should include any rent support due to that tenant, which obviously should then be passed to the landlord. But what then happens is that the next payment is the same and the next payment is the same. So you're always playing catch up. So you're always probably, your rent account is probably always showing these arrears because you're out of kilter with the tenancy agreement or the rent period. And that could be a real worry for some people who have always kept their finances straight.
Thanks for your question, John. Hope you found that helpful. Moving to the next, Ella tells us she's a 35-year-old care worker who faced eviction from her home of 16 years. She claimed universal credit last September, just before she got married. Her fiance was moving into the house she shared with her 15-year-old daughter. This forced a reassessment of her benefit eligibility and shifted her onto the new system. She says 26 queries in her journal raising concerns over incorrect and late payments went unanswered. She racked up £1,600 worth of rent arrears until her local MP intervened and seems to have established some sort of order. What are your views on what Ella has to say?
Well, I think we'll have to wait and see what appetite for universal credit problems all of our MPs have, because I can see that if they are the only sort of explicit consent route into resolving universal credit payments, they're going to be very busy at their local surgeries. I think that was exactly the correct action, involve your MP, because this isn't anything to do with the system itself. This sounds like pure maladministration. You know, that many inquiries on the journal going unanswered. I think if the journal wasn't working, if you strongly believed that messages weren't being picked up, weren't being dealt with, I think the phone would be my next port of call. But of course, until we see those call costs coming down, that could also be an expensive decision that a universal credit claimant who hasn't yet received a payment might have to be making.
And just picking up onto another question we've had from Jason on a similar theme, he says he posted messages on his online journal that went unanswered for days, just as Ella's just described. In terms of the phone line, he says when phoning the DWP hotline, he was sometimes on hold for over an hour on the premium line. And sometimes this amounted to what he would have expected to pay for a day's food money. He says his hardship was brought about by a severe lack of communication and slow response times. So is this sort of, we're picking up here on apparently a general problem. I mean, it's almost as though the system's half there, and a lot of these problems are arriving because it isn't a fully working system. Do you think that's true?
It's a worry, isn't it? Because it will only need to carry more capacity, which suggests that it's not going to improve with more numbers. Usually systems deteriorate when they have to carry more traffic. This has been recognised by the Work and Pensions Select Committee. There is an awful lot of media coverage, as I'm sure you're aware, that all point to just a struggling system and case after case of maladministration. I think if the ambition was for a streamlined, fast, responsive digital system, then I think we're still far away from getting that.
Helen's also contacted us on Carers World Radio Plus, and she has sort of a similar story to tell. She says she put in a joint claim for universal credit with her partner. They waited 8 weeks. There were 3 hours on a premium phone line, 2 unnecessary appointments, which were incorrectly booked by agents. They borrowed money from the family to pay for already late bills. 12 weeks later, Helen received her award after registering her change of circumstances, but was told that her pay was being held back by a decision maker due to a request to have her payment backdated. She received a personal apology from the DWP later down the line for the mistake that had been made and the actions that had been left, or where she'd been left for weeks on hold. An apology at the end hardly cuts it, does it?
catastrophic, isn't it? I think earlier you used in one of the questions about you used the word destitution. The issue with universal credit is that it's all of your benefits rolled into one. So you can't sort of borrow from Peter because Paul's not paying. You're waiting on that payment that is there for you, your children, for your rent, for everything. Particularly for those households who are looking for work or currently can't work because of other things. I mean, that is absolutely catastrophic. And I think that quite often government refers to all of us as consumers or customers, then that's not a service that is responding to customer need. What I would like to see is the DWP universal credit treating these problems and treating individual delays with more of a sense of urgency and understanding that for some people this is about whether they can turn on the heating. This is about whether they can feed their children. Not to just sort of glibly say, it will turn up eventually, you'll be paid your arrears. That's not good enough. There has to be more of an obligation to get these problems solved in a timely and speedy way.
And just finally, for questions from our listeners, Heather was off sick and started to claim universal credit and was told by the DWP that she couldn't get it because she hadn't paid enough national insurance contributions, although she says she was a part-time employee. And in the course of this appears to have discovered that her employer had been fiddling about, effectively treating her as no longer working there. So it's not always a problem with universal credit itself. It can have other consequences. To what extent do you see that type of situation where there's a sort of indirect effect?
Well, first thing I would say is that having paid national insurance has got nothing to do with whether you're entitled to universal credit. It is not a contributory benefit. It's a means-tested benefit. So when you go to claim universal credit, your contribution record matters not a jot. It's about whether your income and any savings that you and your partner, if you have one, collectively hold together. And if you meet the means test, then you'll be entitled to universal credit. Now, a separate issue, which is if you've been working for an employer and they haven't been paying your national insurance, whether that's their national insurance obligations or whether they haven't been paying the national insurance that you've been having deducted from your pay, because that's your employer's responsibility to deduct those through payroll, then I would advise, it was Heather, wasn't it? Heather, to go to a local citizen's advice. What happens is that if Heather was claiming a contributory benefit, then HMRC should treat her, if it's her employer's wrongdoing, they should treat her as if those national insurance payments had been made. So she could take along pay slips or end of year P60 or something like that. HMRC then deal with the employer separately.
So there are two separate issues then. So HMRC for one, but in terms of universal credit, are you essentially saying that NI contributions have nothing to do with it? And that, so if she's told that by the DWP, then she's, if this is, on the facts, this is the DWP giving wrong information.
In that instance, yes.
Very interesting. Well, thank you all for your questions. Much appreciated, as ever, on Carers World Radio Plus. Maria Zealey from Surrey Welfare Rights Unit, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Carers World Radio Plus.
Thank you.
But now let's pick up the politics once more. We heard earlier from the Scottish Nationalists. Now we turn to the Liberal Democrats and hear what former Coalition Minister, the Right Honourable Norman Lamb MP, has to say on universal credit, with apologies for the quality of the internet connection to his North Norfolk constituency.
It was designed at the start of the coalition, and I think the concept is a good one, to simplify benefits and to also create a stronger incentive for people to work and for people to never be worse off in work than they are on benefits. So I think it's a good idea, a good principle, but in subsequent years, and it actually was George Osborne who was responsible for this, he trimmed the budget for universal credit so much that you've lost the value that came with the original design. It means that for every extra pound you earn, you in effect lose the vast majority of that extra pound in the withdrawal of universal credit. So it becomes like a tax, a very high tax rate on the lowest earnings. And the whole point of universal credit was to get rid of that problem, to ensure that as you went into work and your earnings started to increase, that you didn't dramatically lose support from universal credit.
Carers World Radio Plus has asked both the Department for Work and Pensions and the Labour Opposition Front Bench for ministerial and shadow ministerial interviews. Both declined, saying they were too busy with the budget. However, a DWP spokesperson has commented on the issues that you've raised in our investigation. This response appears in detail in the panel below this film. Over now to the House of Commons for the government's latest statement on universal credit, starting with Speaker John Bercow.
Order. Thank you. Statement the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Secretary David Gauke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, following the announcement made by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, in his budget speech yesterday, I'd like to make a statement on universal credit. Universal credit is the biggest modernisation of the welfare state in a generation. It supports those who can work and cares for those who can't. Under universal credit, people are moving into work faster and staying in work longer than under the previous system. Once fully rolled out, universal credit will boost employment by around 250,000, equivalent to around 400 extra jobs for every constituency. Universal credit was introduced to replace the complex and failed benefit system of the previous government, which created cliff edges, discouraging people from working more than 16 hours a week and trapping 1.5 million people on out-of-work benefits for nearly a decade. Colleagues from across the House have all voiced their support for the principles underpinning universal credit. It is a modern welfare system which, through one simple monthly payment, ensures that work always pays, mirrors the world of work and supports people to earn their way out of financial insecurity and welfare dependency. As we introduce universal credit, we are constantly improving how the system works. We recently introduced changes to ensure everyone who needs them has access to advance payments, and we are making our telephone lines free phone numbers. I have consistently made clear that we would continue to introduce universal credit gradually. Of the total number of households that will eventually move on to universal credit, 9% are currently receiving it, and this will increase to 12% by February. This enables us to make improvements over time. Colleagues have had concerns about the waiting times for the first payment. I'm grateful to my parliamentary colleagues for their constructive engagement on this issue. There have been several debates here and in the other place. This statement responds to these and fulfils the commitments made on behalf of the government by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, in relation to the resolution of the House on the 18th of October 2017. We are now offering a balanced package of improvements which puts more money into claimants' hands earlier, ensuring extra support for those who need it most. Next month, new guidance will be issued to staff to ensure that claimants in the private rented sector who have their housing benefit paid directly to landlords are offered this option when they join universal credit. In January, we are making two changes to advances. First, the period of time over which an advance is recovered will increase from 6 to 12 months, making it easier for claimants to manage their finances. This will apply regardless of the level of advance claimed. Second, we are increasing the amount of support a claimant can receive from up to 50% of their estimated entitlement to up to 100% interest-free. In practice, this means that new claimants in December can already receive an advance of up to 50% of their estimated overall entitlement and may receive a second advance to take it up to 100% in the new year. Taken with the first payment, this means that claimants in need could receive nearly double the money they would previously have got. In addition, from spring next year, we will be making it possible to apply for an advance online, further increasing accessibility for those who need it. From February, we are removing the 7-day waiting period, reducing the length of time claimants might wait to receive their first full payment. From April, for new claimants already receiving support towards their housing costs, we are providing an additional payment of 2 weeks of their housing benefit to support them as they transition onto universal credit, helping to address the issue of rent arrears for those who most need it. This is a well-targeted measure which will support 2.3 million people, including the most vulnerable, with an unrecoverable automatic payment worth an average of £233 each. This is a one-off investment of £550 million to ensure universal credit supports those who need it. In April, as a short-term measure, we will change how claimants in temporary accommodation receive support for their housing costs to ensure local authorities can recover more of their costs and can therefore continue to offer this valuable support to those who need it most. We will also consider longer-term solutions to this issue. The majority of claimants are comfortable managing their finances. However, personal budgeting support and digital skills training is provided to claimants through universal support, delivered through local authorities. Building on this, we are exploring with Citizens Advice the scope for greater collaborative working to help claimants locally as they move to universal credit. We must remember that universal credit is aimed at supporting those out of work to move into work, and once in work to progress and increase their earnings. That is why, in addition to these measures, the government has allocated £8 million over 4 years to conduct a number of tests and trials to support development of the evidence about what works to help people progress in work. This is a comprehensive and wide-ranging package worth £1.5 billion, offering significantly more support than a simple reduction of the wait for the first payment to 1 month. To deliver this package, we have carefully revised the UC rollout plan to ensure we continue to safely and gradually roll out this important welfare reform. I will place the updated rollout plan in the House of Commons library. This does not change the final point at which the rollout of universal credit will be completed. To help ensure a smooth transition to full service, we have also decided to close new claims to our prototype Universal Credit Live service. This will not affect any existing claims. In addition, currently any new UC claim from a family with 3 or more children will be routed back to tax credits until November 2018. With the extension to the rollout plan, this will now shift to the end of January 2019. Mr. Speaker, this is a comprehensive package which responds to concerns raised inside and outside the House. We have a clear objective: to ensure that as many people as possible get the opportunity to work and to maximise their potential to better their circumstances. We will continue to roll out universal credit in a steady and considered manner, and in doing so deliver a welfare reform that will positively transform lives. And I commend this statement to the House.
Abrahams.
I thank the Secretary of State for earlier sight of the statement. Mr. Speaker, it is little surprise to see the government announce reforms to their embattled universal credit programme, the budget, yesterday, following months of Labour campaigning, a unanimous defeat on the Opposition Day debate motion, and discontent across the whole House with the rising debt, arrears and even evictions that their social security reforms are causing so many of their constituents. We, of course, welcome any steps to improve the programme, not least the small reduction in the so-called long hello, where those on the lowest incomes will now only be expected to wait 5 weeks for support to arrive, compared with the 6 under the current design. Before I address the detail of today's announcements, let's step back and look at the big picture. The government introduced universal credit with 3 promises: to reduce child poverty by 350,000, to simplify the social security system, and to ensure that work always pays. As the mounting evidence has shown, Mr. Speaker, universal credit is not living up to these ambitions. Now it is our task to see whether the Chancellor's announcements meet the government's own tests. First, the most immediate matter, the reforms announced today are not being introduced until next year and will do nothing for the tens of thousands that are stuck in the 6-week waiting period over Christmas. Anyone who's tried to claim universal credit since Tuesday the 14th of November will now not get their first payment until after Christmas Day. This will mean tens of thousands of families going without over the festive period. Secondly, we are concerned that the government has only decided to remove a single week from the waiting period, taking it down to 5. Under existing DWP guidance on alternative payment arrangements, claimants should be offered the option of being paid every 2 weeks, reflecting their previous employment patterns. A report published by the Resolution Foundation found that 58% of those moving on to UC from work were paid more regularly than monthly, for example. Can the Minister explain if there is capacity in the system to offer claimants more regular payments, the government doesn't change the payment period to fortnightly as opposed to monthly? There was no change to the monthly assessment period that is particularly affecting the self-employed, and I want to press the Secretary of State on why, when it is clearly so punitive. In relation to the advance payment, we have concerns in relation to the details of the extended repayment period for this. So what additional debt does the Secretary of State expect the average claimant to incur? What does his department predict will be the average monthly repayment amount deducted from claimant's income? Mr. Speaker, our position remains the same. The social security system should prevent people from getting into debt, not making matters worse. It is contrary to the ambitions of UC that instead of alleviating poverty, it is going to cause it, let alone an insult to ask people who are not able to make ends meet under the government's punitive reforms to bear even more risk, stress and concern. Turning now to their housing benefit proposals, not due to be introduced until April next year, nearly 6 months after the budget. Support for rent will be available for the first 2 weeks out of the 5 before they receive payment. This leaves a 3-week gap, which is still too long for many to cope, leading to the arrears and even evictions that we've seen from the programme. Finally, Mr. Speaker, this announcement did nothing to restore the key ambition that work will always pay. The swingeing cuts to UC have not been addressed, condemning more disabled people, children and their families to poverty. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, these announcements equate to putting £1 for every 10 that the former Chancellor cut. In a further nonsensical approach, the Chancellor has downgraded planned increases to the national living wage, leaving a full-time worker on the minimum wage £900 a year worse off by 2020. Why has the government failed to give our workers the pay rise they deserve? The government seems content to leave with 17 years pay stagnation. In summary, Mr. Speaker, these measures for UC are not enough. They must be brought forward, amended and added to. We stand ready to work with the government to make the necessary changes. Failing that, they should stand aside and let a Labour government get on with the job.
That's it for this edition of Carers World Investigates. We'll be keeping an eye on developments on the issue of universal credit. If you're experiencing problems regarding UC, please do get in touch by email on news@carersworldradio.com, follow Carers World Radio Plus on Twitter and direct message us, or contact us via our Facebook page. Until next time on Carers World Investigates, take care and keep letting us know how we can help.